Yes. I didn't know till I got here that this does this. And I found out the hard way. Yeah. Well, usually when Pastor Paul asks me to preach, I get all nervous because he has plans. And it's usually right in the middle of something. And today it's right in the middle of something. But I thought, hey, this is good to bring a girl in to preach. I think of myself as a girl. Bring a girl in to preach about Ruth because it's something we know about, girl things, and romance, something we know about. And I, more than anyone, probably know more about romance because my mom and I watch the Hallmark Channel. If you're not laughing, then I don't know why. You really need to watch the Hallmark Channel. Romance after romance after romance, and sometimes there's different ones. And my mom was really cranky last Saturday night, not last night, but the week before, because the Hallmark romance, they put a ghost into it from the 1920s. Do you see that? Okay. She was like, that's not realistic. As if all the Hallmark romances, they are so not realistic. I wonder if you know Kim and Penn Holderness, the Holderness family. They won the Amazing Race a couple years ago, and they were like, their combined ages were the oldest of people. They are not old looking, but they won the Amazing Race, and they are some of the funnest people to follow on the net that you can find. And here's what I found. They have bigger ones talking about Hallmark romances, but here's just a sample.
Steve Borgalugi, is that you?
Chloe Vander Fleming?
Wow.
Wow.
It's good to sit.
I had a crush on you in high school.
Yeah, but now you were good looking.
What are you doing for a living?
I am a New York executive and I am having it all.
Okay.
What are you doing for a living?
I chop down trees for people's Christmas living rooms.
Oh, so you have no money. He is broke.
No, he isn't.
What?
He invented the internet.
Wow, now I am attracted to him. I came to chop trees with you. I'm even wearing gloves.
Wow, you've shown me that you're not just a cold, calculating, materialistic New York girl. You've showed me that you know that love is all that matters.
Yeah, totally.
Hey, Chloe, look in your jacket pocket. It's a surprise.
A wedding ring. Of course, Steve, I will marry you.
Great. Hey, Chloe, I have a confession. I am rich.
You've seen them all now. You've seen them all. Yeah, right? I'm sorry, but I just love them, and they just, yeah. What else is there to do on a Saturday night in my life, really, you know? Just really, really fun. And if you want to follow them, it's the Holderness, not Mess, Ness, the Holderness, Ness family, and they are funny. And if you just Google that, they have long, even musical numbers about every Hallmark Christmas special or Thanksgiving special. Yeah. In other words, all that to say, I know a lot about romance, and so do you. But I got to admit, I didn't know a whole lot about subversive romance until our Pastor Paul, has led us to look at Ruth and has explained to me the first time why it is subversive. The book of Ruth was put into the Old Testament about 455 BC, 450 years before Christ. When the people were returning to Judah from being just decimated and sent away to Babylon, the people began to come back, and under the priest Ezra and the governor Nehemiah, these two guys, they decided, we got to figure out the most strict way to be like we were supposed to be before we got ruined, you know. We got to be as Jewish as we possibly can. And so they enacted all of the old Levitical laws, and one of those was that they were to get rid of all the Moabites. Moabites were not Israelites. Moabites were from another area, and God had put them there, and they were there, but the Israelites were never, ever to commingle or co-marry with them. So trying to be as Jewish as the Jews could be, Ezra the priest and Nehemiah the governor said, here's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to get rid of them because they're just not pure Israelites like us. And so they said, all the men who had married Moabite wives in the meantime when they were scattered all over, who now they had come back to Jerusalem. They said, you're going to have to get rid of them. And they ordered them to divorce their wives, send them away, along with their children who had Moabite blood. They were looking toward a Torah edict that said anyone who has had a Moabite ancestor in the last 10 generations, in other words, your great grandfather, if they had a drop of Moabite blood, you could never be welcomed into the nation of Israel and never into the God of Yahweh worship and never into the temple. And it was kind of idiomatic saying to the 10th generation. It was kind of idiomatic to saying never. Never. Ain't gonna happen. Some places in Scripture it would say to the 3rd generation, and that kind of meant maybe. Because, by the time your grandchildren get here, if you're doing okay and everything, you might be admitted to the 3rd generation. But 10th, never. You will never be admitted into the fellowship of Israel. So the book of Ezra, Pastor Paul told us last week, ends with a sad list, of 117 names of Israelite men who divorced their Moabite women and banished their own children in order to be in Jerusalem with the ultra-conservative, isolationist Jews who to be part of that. And they did all that with, sounds like crazy to say, but they did all that with kind of good intentions. They thought that they were pleasing God, that they were creating a pure and clear people that would worship God in this new temple they were building the walls to around Jerusalem, that would worship God, and God would bless them and treat them like the chosen children that they knew they were. Well, someone, we don't know their name, but someone decided that they didn't like this new rule, getting rid of all the Moabite wives, many of whom who had converted and been faithful Israeli wives. They didn't like that, and so someone didn't fight, didn't make a sign and protest, didn't shout at the temple, didn't bomb the temple. Instead, this person, a subversive, this person composed the book of Ruth, telling a love story that below the hallmarkish surface is a subversive romance. I'm glad I know that now. This person's making a very important point. So I made us a cast of characters because Pastor Paul just whips those names out and I go, what, who, when, how, what? Yeah, okay. The cast of characters. They came from Bethlehem, this couple, Elimelech, which means God is great. Ladies, get you a man whose name is God is great. You know what he's all about, right? God is great. He's going around through his life in Bethlehem, and every time anybody saw them, they went, hey, God is great. And he said, yes. It was his testimony. It was who he was. So from Bethlehem, which is the house of bread, Elimelech and his wife Naomi, pleasant. Guys, get you a girl whose name is Pleasant. There are none. I'm sorry, there are none. And they had 2 sons, Mahlon, whose name meant sickness, and Chilion, whose name meant destruction. And when the famine, and it happened, a famine struck that area of Bethlehem. You know another time it happened? It happened when Joseph was down in Egypt being the number 1 guy under Pharaoh, and his brothers were sent by their father Jacob because there was a famine in this area where they lived, no bread. And so he sent his brothers down there, and guess what they found? Their brother Joseph. Some of you remember that story. Yeah, it's happened before. This time, this family didn't go down to Egypt, although I bet there were a lot of people who did during this famine. They didn't go down to Egypt, but they went across and around the bottom of the Dead Sea to this land of Moab. And Elimelech and Naomi and their sons, Mahlon and Chilion, lived there and found work and survived. During that 10 years, Mahlon and Chilion found brides. The first one was Orpah, which, in case you didn't know, that's where Oprah's name came from. I heard that. Her name Oprah was a misspelling that her mother put, but she wanted a biblical name, and it was Oprah. Anyway, you don't really care. Orpah, I can't say it now, Mahlon's wife, Orpah, and Chilian's wife, Ruth. And so there were the 6 of them. And during that 10 years, Elimelech, who had lived his life praising the greatness of God, he died. And Naomi was made a widow. She was mad. Pastor Paul told us last week, she was pretty hurt. She was pretty mad, and she really thought God had done this. And when the rereading of Ruth this week, I said, yes, she thought God did this to her. And then her elder son died, the one named Sickness. Maybe he was puny from the time he was a kid. I don't know. He died, and she's saying, God, why are you doing this to me? So there were 2 widows. And then Ruth's husband, Chilion, whose name was Destruction. I bet he got that name when he was 2 years old. What do you bet? Destruction. He died perhaps from an accident, and he died, and then there were 3 widows. And Naomi, who was usually pleasant, wasn't. She was destroyed. She was absolutely destroyed. So she had heard that back in Bethlehem the famine was over. People were thriving again. And so she said, I don't know what, her guys were buried there, but she said, there's nothing here for me but bitterness. Nothing here for me. And I doubt there were very many Jews, if any, around that area, because that's just not where you usually went. But this subversive author telling this love story says, they were in Moab, and she was bringing back to Bethlehem then, her 2 daughters-in-law who were Moabite women. Well, very shortly on the way, she said, Naomi thought, I'm responsible for 2 other people. I can't even take care of myself. And she said, girls, you really need to go back to your families. Let your mother take care of you. Let your father arrange another marriage for you. Your life will be better here. Go back to Moab. Go back to your families and to your gods. Orpah was eventually convinced, and she left. And it says the last thing she saw was Orpah, or the nape of her neck, as she went back. She wasn't happy about it, but she went back. Ruth, on the other hand, clung to Naomi and said, entreat me not to leave you. Where you go, I love what she said here. We use it in weddings sometimes. It's not about weddings, but it's okay. Where you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you live, I'll live, and where you die, I'll die. And where you get buried, I'll be buried. And Naomi said, I see you feel passionately about it. So Naomi went with her. And the Israelite woman and the Moabite woman went back to Bethlehem. And it just so happens that they arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest. Thus begins, the barley harvest, thus begins episode 2. So, as Naomi had been new to a foreign land once, that must have been a rough thing. Her God was sure, her husband was sure God is great, and so they were acting like Israelites in the land of Moab. That must have been hard. That must have been weird. But now Ruth, her daughter-in-law, is coming, and everybody knows what a Moabite woman is. Everybody knows what a Moabite woman is. Moab is a people who were born of Lot, Abraham's nephew, if you go way back and read. They were born from Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot was a mess, but God gave them this land to live in because they were Abraham's also descendants. And people in Israel looked at them and they said, you all are not even supposed to exist. That's what they thought of Moabites. You were born of incest. God never meant that to happen. God never meant you to happen, and you should not even exist. Your women are seductresses, and you should not mix with us Jews. So one of them was who Ruth was coming back to Israel with her mother-in-law Naomi. That was a rough gig. That was a tough choice to make. She did feel really passionate about this. And according to Torah law, she's coming to a land where she didn't have even a small chance unto the 10th generation of ever really belonging. She would always be that foreigner. Widows and orphans, like I was telling the children, and aliens. Widows and orphans were the most vulnerable people in that society. And the care of widows and orphans was the center of God, Yahweh's prophetic justice. You know, Israelites, you're my chosen people. I love you. You're my chosen people, God say to them. And they didn't ever get, I don't think, quite what they were chosen for. And the thing they were chosen for was to exhibit and carry out God's prophetic justice to always take care of the least, the last, and the lost. So Ruth and Naomi end up back in Bethlehem. Yeah, that Bethlehem. They end up back in Bethlehem, and it's the beginning of the harvest. Leviticus 19:9, this slide tells us, this is back in the Levitical teachings. This is a law. When you harvest the crops from your land, you should not harvest all the way to the edges of your field or gather the remaining crops. Instead, you should leave them for the poor and alien. Foreigner, okay. This practice is a common way to help those in need, and it is commanded by the Lord. So when it's harvest time in Bethlehem, you leave some crops in the field for the poor. You should also leave the corners unharvested, just to make it easy for the poor to go by and see that there's something there to glean. This is part of the social, we call it now a social safety net, to take care of widows and orphans. And then later on in Deuteronomy, there's a law states that if you forget, they even made it more specific. If you forget a sheaf in your field while harvesting, you should not go back to get it. If you look over, it's almost dark, and you're going, oh, somebody left a sheaf over there. You shall not go back to get it. It is commanded that you leave it for the alien, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God will bless you. You don't do it for you, but God is going to bless you if you will do this to bless the widow, the orphan, and the alien. To be chosen, Israel, God is saying, to be chosen means to exhibit social justice and economic mercy towards the most vulnerable people in your society. That's so what we're about to do, isn't it? So what we're about to do the day before Thanksgiving. Is it the day before Thanksgiving? Yeah. That's so what we're going to do. The most vulnerable, I delivered some of those last year, more than a meal. And who I delivered them to were some of the most vulnerable in our community. We hope we find all of the most vulnerable of our community, and we hope that everybody can do a part to make sure that we can take care of all the vulnerable in our community for one day more than a meal. That's what it means to be chosen. That's what it means for us to be chosen, to be Christians, to know Christ, to follow Christ, to be in this fellowship of this church family, to be chosen by God, to be here and now and blessed. That's what it means. To use everything we have to bless those who are outside, those who are outsider. Matter of fact, in the church across the world, if any group asserts that they are specifically chosen by God, they must also acknowledge the special obligation they have to ensure justice for the most vulnerable. Something tells me that could change the world we live in. If just the churches around the world acknowledge that, yeah, God's chosen us, we are so blessed. And what does that mean? That means that as long as there's one vulnerable person in our sphere of influence, we are called to ensure justice for them. That could change everything, I think, yeah. So it was very fortunate that Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem at the start of the barley harvest, and Ruth goes out to glean. It has told us already that there's this Boaz guy around, but it hasn't told us anything else about him. But he's out there, we know, and we're just waiting for him to find each other in this romance. And so she goes out to glean because she's the young and tough and strong one. Boaz, or her mother-in-law Naomi, is an elder, and of course us elders stay home and watch Hallmark movies, don't we? We send the girls out to glean. And she goes out and just perchance just happens to go this way and that way and end up in a field where she sees harvesters getting behind them, and it happens to be the field belonging to a man named Boaz. That name's not on our cast of characters yet, but what it means is strong. Boaz is strong. He has great strength. He's named after one of the pillars of the temple. There was a big old pillar there holding up the temple, and they called it Boaz. And they called Boaz Boaz. In other words, he's a pillar of strength. Boaz goes out there and he says to everybody who's working, the Lord be with you, and the Lord bless you. His people said back to him. In other words, they had this relationship, blessing each other. And then he looks around and he sees maybe some more gleaners, but he sees this young woman. He says, who's that one young woman over there? Remember, Bethlehem's kind of a small town. You could be a shepherd on the thing, and an angel could appear. You could run down and look in every chapel or stable in my town, and you could find a baby Jesus. It's just a small town. So everybody knew everybody, and he said, who's this girl over here? And his supervisor says to him, she's the Moabite. The Moabite. Because how many Moabites are there running around Bethlehem? One. She's the Moabite woman. Do you not remember Elimelech? And he left, and his wife Naomi came back, and her men are all dead. She came back not too long ago, and she brought with her the Moabite woman. And man, this Moabite woman, this supervisor says, she has been working all day long, barely took a break. So Boaz does something that men really weren't supposed to do back then. He went up to a young woman, and he said to her, you a foreigner? He knew she was a foreigner, and she knew she was a foreigner. Let's put that right out there. Foreigner, he said, you are welcome to glean in my field. And he said, you don't even have to go to any other fields. Just follow my harvesters, go behind them, and you will be able to glean all you need from my fields. Not just today, forever. And when you get thirsty, go over to the pots of water that we have brought out to the field for the workers and help yourself. You don't need to ask. That was unheard of too. You don't even need to ask, just go eat. And when it was time for the lunch, I always think of the Amish when I think of let's feed the harvesters, and you get the big table and there's all that food, and that's in the Amish Hallmark movies. That's when I get hungry and go get something to eat because it just is so beautiful and everything. Well, Boaz did that for his workers, and he said to Ruth, come and eat with us. And she was like, oh my gosh. So she goes and she eats a little, and Boaz says, no, and he just takes her plate and fills it up. And then when she's done eating, he says, oh, there's leftovers, look at this. And he just wraps them all up and he sends them home. Take them home to your mother-in-law. Take them home. And then the scripture tells us that he blessed her. He blessed her. And he said this, may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. He said, I heard what you've done for your mother-in-law Naomi, and I thank you. I thank you for it. And he blessed her. He says, may you not just be rewarded a little, but may you be rewarded a lot, because you haven't just come to this place with Naomi. You've come to dwell under the wings of the God of Israel, and you may find refuge. He speaks this beautiful blessing over her. And you know, Boaz is not a theologian, he's a farmer. But he does seem to have, according to this author of this subversive romance, he does seem to have a very generous theology about God's love for Israel and beyond. Perhaps more generous than Ezra and Nehemiah and Israel itself. So Ruth goes back to gleaning, and it gets to be the end of the day. And they quit for the day, and she takes her gleanings, which are way more than they should have been, because Boaz had also gone to his people, his supervisor and his people were gleaning, and said, we want to drop some things, okay? Like, forget the sheaf over there. Help the girl out, okay? And when the boss says do that, you do that, right? So she's picking up all kinds of barley, and she's got it all with her, and she goes home to Naomi that night. Naomi's like, oh my gosh, we're rich. We have enough to eat. We have some to sell. Oh my gosh, and what is that? Food? Prepared food, leftovers? She says, where in the world were you, and how did this happen? And Naomi says to her, well, I just went this way, and I ended up in this guy's field, and he was so kind. He asked me to lunch, and then he just gave me the leftovers, and he let me glean as long as he wants me to come back. And Naomi says, most importantly, who is this guy? And then she says the word, Boaz, man of strength. Boaz. Boaz. And Naomi flips out. I don't know how to do an older lady flipping out, but she did. She flips out and she says, Boaz, oh, Boaz, oh my gosh, Boaz. She says, Boaz, blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or dead. This man is related to my late husband. He's one of our redeeming kin. Oh, that's going to be so important. He's one of our redeeming kin to be our salvation. This is a God thing. Naomi ending up in his field, a God thing. Many, many more God things to follow. Now Naomi knows it. Now Ruth knows it. And that, my friends, is the end of episode 2. Next week, episode 3, Boaz. Let me just warn you, you don't want to miss this one. In the next episode, it takes place late at night on the threshing floor of Boaz. Our subversive romance is about to heat up, folks, and I will gladly turn this pulpit back to Pastor Paul next week. Yes, I will. But that's a little preview you don't want to miss. The big idea for us today, though, and it is a big idea. This subversive romance writer, I love him or her, whoever it is, because they're pointing to the fulfillment of the gospel and who God's people are supposed to be. The big idea is Jesus is your Boaz, your Redeemer. Jesus is my Boaz. Jesus is our Boaz. He is our strength when we are weakest. He is our strength when we are lost. He is our strength when we are absolutely exhausted. Jesus is our Boaz, and all outsiders are invited to his table. Jesus comes and he says to us, he invites us to his table, and he sees us that sometimes we're like all by ourselves trying to survive. All by ourselves, all lost, all hungry, or like Naomi, grieving our souls out, afraid, alone. He sees us sin sick and sorrow worn. And Jesus, our Boaz, the perfect Boaz. Jesus says, come to my table, partake of the bread, partake of the wine. I know you feel empty and you're not making it on your own. He says, so I've prepared a table for you to share with you myself, my flesh, my blood, my life. See, Jesus is our Redeemer. It says, no, you come. Be a part of us. Come to the table. You are welcome here. Amen.